Hey guys, welcome to the next module in Film 101. So we're going to be going over narrative and basic storytelling techniques. And the film for this week is Summer Hours. So we're going to go over all of that, and let's get to it. First thing I want to talk about is what makes the story interesting. Because we can have films and we can say, you know, King Kong is this really exciting film, and it was an exciting film in the 30s because all the special effects and things like that. But on some level, it was interesting because we saw giant ape, and we saw what happened to the giant ape, and we saw this journey of a giant ape, and he went, and we had this love interest in these things that we could relate to, and the reason that King Kong became this interesting film was because of that. There are films that we watch simply because there are car chases, or because there is a hot actor or hot actress in, or something like that. But at the core of what keeps our interest over a long period of time is a story. Uh, there are lots of movies that have really attractive actors or actresses in them that don't have strong storytelling, and our attention is not engaged. And so, what makes a film? What keeps our attention? Um, a lot of it's going to have to do with the language that we speak, not meaning English or French or German, but but what what foundational aspects of understanding movies there are. So if we have experience watching kind of gritty, newsy films from the 30s and 40s, then those films are going to speak to us in a certain way, rather than if we had never seen them and we'd only watched, you know, romantic comedies, something like that. Whereas if our only exposure to films have been sci-fi or big explosion films, then romantic comedies are not going to be interesting to us at all. Um, and so a lot of that is going to be based on the viewer, right? I'd like to bring some other things to the discussion, however. When we talk about interesting stories, a lot of it just has to do with an interesting character. Um, and a lot of the materials that we have, both of the PowerPoints talk about interesting characters versus a flat character. How do we define interesting? That's so hard because I might find something interesting that you might not, and your mother might not, and my mother might not. Uh, so, what makes something interesting to me and not to some other person? Well, one thing I think that can help us understand without personal preference is a phrase I like to think of that is paradox. There is a Russian structuralist theorist that talks about poetry being paradox. I think that characters become interesting if they become paradoxical or poetic. Um, so, an example, we have this idea of the Birdman of Alcatraz. And so we've got someone who was a murderer who had committed these heinous crimes, but he had gentleness. So there's brutality in these crimes, but then there's gentleness, right? In the idea that he would take care of these birds. And so he becomes interesting because we want to know who that person is and what makes them tick. We look at something like the TV series House, where you've got this deeply failed physician who's really good at what he does, but he's actually very, very sick and himself. I mean, his all of his relationships are off, and so the idea of a doctor is someone who not only is able to heal someone, but that his whole himself, but this doctor is not. You know, he's not the only sick doctor character that's existed, obviously, but that's a reason that this character becomes interesting to us. Is we see the push and the pull of these characters. Think of the greatest characters that you know, and that these ideas are going to apply to them. Probably, they engage us because they're not straightforward. A character is flat if one character trait is all of the character traits that are the same. So, for instance, if someone is a brutal murderer and they're always brutal, that's their only character trait. It's just that they're brutal. But if they're brutal and gentle, that becomes something very interesting. So let's think about this. Now, a man who's been in the news in the United States a lot. This guy who, man, I can't even remember his name. Who is this mogul of this hedge fund mogul who went over and he took over a pharmaceutical company, and he increased the price for this drug some, like, 500% or something like that. It's just this really horrible thing. And then he's the guy who, if that's all that we know about him, he's not an interesting character. But then there are all these stories about him going on dating websites like OkCupid. And so we've got this guy who really takes advantage of people that are in a desperate situation and milks them for all that they're worth, which is really kind of a horrible thing. But then you see him being really vulnerable in a public sphere. And then you see that the only reason he bought that Wu-Tang album for $1 million was the only reason he did that was so that he could get a date. I mean, that's terribly desperate. So we've got this guy who takes advantage of people with this completely horrible characteristic, but then he's just desperate for love. That's an interesting character to me, So characters in movies that have that push and pull are the ones that we are going to be interested in. And we can say there are anti-heroes or they're regular heroes. I don't know that I find that delineation super helpful. They can be. You look at something like Taxi Driver or most of Scorsese's films. You go and you look at how these characters are in the depths, the dark places, and we still follow them. They become interesting to me not because they are anti-heroes, but because we see ourselves in them, actually. That we see ourselves in them. Here is a question I want us to be asking ourselves. Why is it that we root for characters? Because we can find ourselves watching a film and wanting a character to accomplish something that we ourselves would never accomplish. Wanting them to find love, or maybe not to find love. We might watch a heist film and think, I want them to rob this bank. What in a film makes it so that we want a robber to rob a bank? Most of us would never actually do that. Most of us would never want to do that. Maybe perhaps we do secretly want to rob a bank, and so this is feeding on our most secret desires. But I think that there's another element of what films can do that change the morality of how these stories and these characters are structured. And this is a basic task of the class. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and in the discussion boards and in the quizzes, these things are being asked. The thing that I'm looking for is not right answers. We're not looking for what the right thing is or the wrong thing is. What we're looking for instead is, are we thinking about it? There's not a profession in the world that wants you to have a right answer for this. If you go and you become a really high-up film executive, no one will ever ask you who's the protagonist of the film and expect you to have the right answer. You need to be conversant. You need to be thoughtful. But there are plain and simple many right answers to that question in most films. So you will be a better film thinker if you stop thinking, is this the right answer or the wrong answer? You'll be a better film thinker if you start thinking, well, how can I justify the way that I see this? I don't want you to be thinking in terms of right and wrong. Okay, so let's talk about what makes a story interesting, what makes a character interesting. I think about this man that I know who is a professor at the university I went to when I was younger, and he told me once that every year he reads these 4 books, and he thought that, so he reads the same 4 books every year, and then he realized that there was one more book, and he said, I can now start reading Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. And he said, it is inexhaustible to me. And what does that mean, inexhaustible? That meant for him, he could read it countless times and derive worth, profundity, pleasure grace whatever we want to say every time that he read this book. And so he committed to reading it once a year for the rest of his life. This is a very long book, but he reads it once a year for the rest of his life. He's obviously a fast reader. This is fascinating to me. Are the books that we read inexhaustible? Could we read them more than once? Are the films we watch inexhaustible? Could we watch them multiple times? Could we derive things from them over and over and over again? That's a beautiful question I think we should be asking. Are the stories dynamic, interesting, full of poetry, and are they unexpected? Are they still unexpected even though we know the spoilers, even though we know the plot twists and turns? This is a thing we should be thinking about. There's a lot of material that talks about the difference between plot and story, and I talked about it last week. But as we think about those things, we should ask ourselves this question: is it still surprising, even if I know the plot? Once I've seen it, is it still surprising? Another question I want to ask is, how do we define what drama is? Drama is when we have one character who has a goal, and we have another character who has another goal, and these two characters' goals are in opposition to each other. Sometimes the film presents this is a good guy, this is a bad guy, or vice versa. It becomes most interesting when the good guy does bad things and the bad guy does good things. But who do we choose to follow, and who has the drives? It's most interesting when we have these two characters and we're following both of them, and they are in opposition to each other. That's not always the case. So one would be a protagonist, and another would be an antagonist. Another question I want to ask is, are there times when we don't have an antagonist and we simply have an obstruction? Okay, so a big part of the way that we are looking at the way narratives structure themselves is the way that we utilize time. One thing that's really big about time and understanding how time functions in a movie, if you look at an epic film, you watch it for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and it oftentimes will traverse decades of time. That's an important thing. Film can do that. We choose what events we want to look at, and we have 3 hours, but it'll go over several decades. We have other films, however. There's an Iranian film called The White Balloon, where essentially it's an hour and a half of this girl's life. And all it is she's trying to get enough money to buy a goldfish by the end of the film. Because it is Nowruz, and you need to see, it's a big thing for you to have a goldfish on Iranian New Year. That's a big thing. So she's trying to get money and trying to like figure out a way to get this goldfish. And the whole time we are thinking, will she get the goldfish? Will she get the goldfish? Will she get the goldfish? Who's the bad guy in the film? There are things and people that stand in the way, but there's not really a bad guy in the film. Not every film, not every story has a protagonist-antagonist structure. But there are many obstacles, obstructions in the way. So that's a beautiful thing. You can have the same kind of structure in an epic film or in a real-time film, but these are so two different things we're talking about right now. Is one, the way we experience time. Is it real-time? Film uniquely has the capability of discussing real-time. Or we have something that's epic, where we have decades and decades, and it's crunched down to 3 hours. And so the way we experience film is a big part of the way that the narrative is constructed. The second thing we're talking about is, what's a protagonist, what's an antagonist? So a protagonist is the character that we follow, that we see change, that we see grow, that we see make the choices that lead the story to take place. They're the ones who experience the inciting incident. They're the ones who experience the crisis. They're the ones who experience the climax, and they're the ones who make the resolving decisions, and we're left with them at the end. This is a big deal. The antagonist is the character who has an opposing desire or goal. But we don't always have an antagonist. So many of Miyazaki's films, any of you who've seen Studio Ghibli films, they are very often antagonist-less films. Um, so this is a beautiful idea. How do we structure stories? Um, uh, a big thing in my household, I don't let my daughter watch Disney films because the way that good guys and bad guys are portrayed, I can't get behind her seeing a morality that says people are bad and people are good. I can't get behind that. My personal worldview is that people are good. They do bad things, but they're good. And so the films I'm interested in and the films that I make are also interested in that kind of dynamic where there's not a person who's bad, because I think those characters are not interesting and they're not true to my view of reality. Um, anyway, the things I want to get across before I end are there's no right or wrong answer for structuring and how you view these things. Um, I want you to just be thinking about them, right? To be asking questions. And the better you do that, the more adaptable you'll be in other real world situations, in business situations, in relationships, in thinking about literature, in thinking about history, in thinking about politics. You're just going to do better and you're going to be smarter thinkers if you think through these questions, I think. Um, uh, so the film that we're watching this week, Summer Hours, is the first film that's a foreign film. I think it's one of the most radiant films of the last 15 years. I really do. It has affected me in some ways more than any other film during that time period. It is, in my mind, a masterpiece. It is a closet family drama, in not meaning come out of the closet like that, but meaning that there's not any special effects, there's not any big things that happen. It's an interior film. But it speaks about such big things. I feel like it speaks about what is going on in the world right now more than any film I am presently aware of. It's a deeply profound film for me. So I want you to be asking yourself these questions. Who's the protagonist of this film? Who do we follow? Who do we not follow? Who do we think we're going to follow? What events in the film set up the Act 1, Act 2, Act 3? Where are the act breaks? What is an act? You know? The end of the film, we end with characters who are not characters that you would typically think you would end the film with. This is, in my mind, a very bold move. Why did we end with those characters? Why did we not end with some other character? Who do we lose in the film? Who do we stop following that we thought we might follow longer? What irony exists? Dramatic irony, if this isn't discussed in the materials, dramatic irony is when the audience knows something that the characters do not know. So they don't know something, but we do. This has to do with diegetics, etc., etc. But how is irony used in the film? How is dramatic irony used in the film? Meaning, when do we know something that the characters don't, and how does it affect the film? It's a beautiful film. I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say about it on the discussion boards, and talk to you soon.